Bees themselves are the greatest teacher. The end result of poor beekeeping practices is that lots of bees die and bees just abscond from their hive, and that's what happens with colony collapse disorder. Basically, it all comes down to greed and overproduction.
Daniel B. Shepherd was one of my favorite folks that I met in Australia. He actually is a beekeeper who understands how to honor the bee-ness of bees. It really does remind me of Joel Salatin, always talking about letting the animals, or I guess the insects, express their full identity. Daniel manages the bees so beautifully. He talked a lot in our conversation about how to prioritize their health over honey production and how wonderful it is to see them thriving. And he also had kind of a controversial opinion about colony collapse disorder and what's behind that. So check out what he had to say at his wonderful bee farm in Australia. Daniel, thanks for taking time today.
Sure, my pleasure.
So he was just showing us all the hives, and you guys, this just reminds me of how we should treat bees the same way we treat animals. Like, let them have their dignity, let them express their bee-ness. Weren't you saying that a second ago?
Yeah, let the bees express the natural essence of what it is to be a bee.
And so how do you do that with your bee-centered beekeeping?
Well, that's a very wide question in lots of different ways. But yeah, we let the bees do what they want to do, and instead of trying to force them to be our way, we look to the bees to teach us how we should be treating them, and sort of support the bees in doing what they want to do rather than forcing them to do what we want them to do. Yeah.
Like the natural beekeeping thing with queens, for example, is just let the queen go ahead and mate with these drones, right? And then live out her little life. Whereas conventional beekeeping, they just kind of cut off the queen's head and move on with another queen after a bit.
Yeah, generally speaking, with conventional beekeeping, the queen is killed every year or every 2 years. And the idea behind that is that new young queens are more productive. But there's no need to do that at all. The bees will replace their queen when they need to. And the problem with requeening is that it creates a genetic bottleneck, because most of the queens come from the same place. And so almost all of the commercial bees are bred from the same genes. And so if there's a problem, if there's a disease that wipes out the bees, it's going to wipe out all of the bees. Whereas if the genes were diverse, it would probably only affect some of them. And that's happened a lot in agriculture in the past. It's happened with bananas. I don't know if you're aware, but most bananas are cloned. They don't have seeds. So all of the bananas that we eat, they're basically genetically identical. And in the past, there's been a disease that wiped out the entire species of bananas that we use. And then we needed to recolonize the banana farms with a new species of banana. That's how we ended up with the Cavendish banana. Yeah. And it's happened with bees as well in the past. There's been diseases that wiped out an entire population of bees because they were so genetically similar. The Isle of Wight disaster, you can look that up. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's like we try to make nature do things our way, and we're totally turning things upside down, right? Put your hands in the middle. It's an American thing. Put your hands in the middle, and we'll say 1, 2, 3, and we all lift our hands up and say B. Ready? 1, 2, 3. B! Yeah.
What I use for fuel in my smoker is just pine needles, which come from that tree over there. They're good for just a short inspection because they don't stay lit very long. A pheromone, which most people call the attack pheromone, it smells like bananas, and you get pretty familiar with that smell as a beekeeper. And so it is recommended not to eat bananas around bees because it can set them off. Here we can see a really good example of the natural comb. You can see the way that the bees start from the top. All right. And what's going on here is what we call festooning. So the bees grab onto each other like they are, and nobody really knows why they do it, but what we do know is where they festoon is usually where they're about to build comb. So what we think is happening is that they're measuring the area and deciding how to put the comb there. Yeah. So we've got quite a lot going on in this frame. The big bulgy cells are the drone brood. So those are the male bees, and at this time of year, just coming into spring, the bees are making a lot of drones because they're getting ready to mate with the queens. So that's what conventional beekeepers try to avoid by using the foundation.
Like we were talking earlier about the colony collapse disorder. You're like, that's really of our own making. Can you explain that a little bit?
Again, it's quite a complex topic and quite sort of controversial to talk about in many ways, but I would say that colony collapse disorder isn't really a thing in itself. It's just a way of explaining poor beekeeping practices. It's just that the end result of poor beekeeping practices is that lots of bees die and bees just abscond from their hive, and that's what happens with colony collapse disorder. And so it's a combination of a million different things, and but basically it all comes down to greed and overproduction.
Talk to us about one thing you do that you would recommend all beekeepers do that you feel like is really good for the bees and good for us.
Well, overall, I'd say we should be learning from the bees. Look to the bees for what methods we should be using, and the bees themselves are the greatest teacher. And so, I mean, that's pretty general. I mean, I do my style of beekeeping, and that's really appropriate for what I do, but I'm not criticizing the way that commercial beekeepers operate. They operate in a certain paradigm, and the way they operate is probably good for the way that they do things. It's kind of horses for courses. But what I'm trying to get across is that these commercial methods that are used across the board for both commercial and hobbyist backyard beekeepers, they're not really that appropriate for hobbyist backyard beekeepers. The commercial methods are just taken on blindly by hobbyists because that's what's taught to them, that's what's in the books, that's what they learn when they go to beekeeping clubs. But there are other ways, and those other ways are much more appropriate for most backyard beekeepers. Yeah.
And you've got the honey to prove it.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, I try not to focus on the honey side of things. I mean, that's sort of at the essence of what I do as an apicentric or bee-centered beekeeper, is we focus on the bees, and it's about the bees, not about the honey. But bees make honey, and they are honeybees after all, and in a good season when conditions are right, they'll make a lot of honey, probably more than you could eat, and more than you and your family could eat, probably more than you and your family and your close friends could eat. Right. So yeah, under certain conditions they do make an abundance of honey, and so yeah, sometimes there is honey. Yeah.
But I see, just like I don't know, in confined animal feeding operations, the objective of the farmer is to fatten up the cow, to get them to market, to make the most money. But so your objective is not to make the most honey to make the most money. What is your objective in your beekeeping?
Look, it's a good question, and I think that it's kind of changed over time. When I first got into this thing that I do, it was all about saving the bees, because I thought that bees were under threat, and that they needed to be saved. Having been involved with bees for a lot longer now, I'm not sure whether that's the case. I mean, I think bees generally definitely need saving. Not a lot of people know how many different species of bees that there are. In Australia alone, there's something in the region of 1,800 different species of bee. And the European honeybee is just one of those species. And the European honeybee is the species that we've decided to somewhat domesticate and use in agriculture. And so those are the ones that we pay attention to. But all of the native bees that aren't as so-called useful for us, we just kind of ignore. And I mean, we're still discovering new species of bee all across the world and in Australia. And really, those are the bees I think we should be focusing on. Those are the ones that need saving. But the problems that they're facing are widespread use of chemical pesticides and other what's the word for just general poisons, and also lack of habitat as well. So I think really that's what we should be looking at. You know, people get into beekeeping to save the bees, and it's a bit of a folly. I think getting a colony of European honeybees thinking that you're saving the bees is like getting chickens and thinking you're saving the birds. You know, it's not really that helpful for bees overall. And in fact, in Australia, where European honeybees are an invasive species, it could be said that you're causing some harm by doing that. Really, what we should be doing to save the bees is giving them habitat. Plant flowers. That's the best thing you can do for the bees, is plant flowers. But that's not to say don't get bees, because I think that there are massive benefits in having bees. And the way that I look at it now is, you know, I provide bees for a lot of different people, or through the Adopt a Hive program, put bees at a lot of different people's houses. And I think that it literally expands people's consciousness, because those bees are foraging in a 3 to 5 kilometer radius around that beehive. And those people are thinking about that. And they're thinking about what's in that 3 to 5 kilometers around that beehive. And it literally expands consciousness, because you're thinking about a wider area that you wouldn't have thought about before. It's kind of a foot in the door to ecology generally. So people start to think about these things. And I'd like to think that people get into it a bit more than just superficially as a result of having bees. I don't know if that made sense.
It totally makes sense. I want to expand my consciousness. I want bees in my backyard. I was going to ask you, do you think they have the Adopt a Hive program in the United States also?
Yeah, there's a lot of people doing it these days. Yeah, there are.
That's really cool. Well, thanks for expanding our consciousness.
Sure. All right, thank you.
Thanks for watching, you guys. Let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video. Subscribe so you don't miss a thing, and click on the notification bell so you can be alerted the next time I upload a video. We'll talk soon. Hasta pronto.